Thursday Food for Thought program. For those who are just joining us, my name is Monica Young, and I am president for Old Pueblo Archaeology Center in Tucson, a nonprofit organization that is bringing you this presentation. For tonight's Third Thursday program, Old Pueblo is delighted to welcome our guest presenter, Ms. Kathryn Leonard, the State Historic Preservation Officer for Arizona, whose position is often referred to as the SHPO. Kathryn is a professional archaeologist and historian. She is a graduate of Vassar College and holds a master's degree in anthropology and history from Arizona State University. She has worked in both the public and private sectors to provide expertise in National Register of Historic Places eligibility, compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and tribal government-to-government consultations for federal undertakings. As Arizona's SHPO, Kathryn works with her State Historic Preservation Office team to promote historic preservation as a tool for economic development in both rural and urban areas. She works with state and federal agencies, municipalities, Indian tribes, and the development community to ensure that cultural resources, which include archaeological sites, are integrated into all aspects of short and long-range planning. When she's not being the SHPO, Kathryn says she enjoys camping with her family, drinking coffee, knitting, and, I quote, reading all the books, seriously, all of them, unquote. This evening, she will provide an overview of the National Historic Preservation Act, identify the roles SHPOs in ensuring that each state's most fragile heritage resources are considered in project planning, and how individual and local efforts to preserve archaeological resources relate to the federal preservation program. So I'm delighted to welcome this month's Third Thursday Food for Thought guest speaker, Arizona SHPO, Kathryn Leonard.
Thank you, Monica. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you, Al, for inviting me here today. It is my pleasure to be here. And again, I'm always so honored when I see folks logging in at the 7 p.m. hour at night to hear about archaeology or hear about the work of the SHPO. That's some true dedication, and I really appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to share my screen right now to start my presentation. And I'm gonna ask for a thumbs up. Are we good here?
We're good.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so I'm gonna spend, say, probably almost the next hour, maybe a little bit less, depends on how chatty I feel, talking about essentially what it is that the State Historic Preservation Office does, but the framework of the broader federal preservation network. And I think when I meet people who have familiarity with cultural resources work, sometimes they have familiarity at the federal level, sometimes they have familiarity at the local level, and sometimes they get the two confused, and sometimes there's not a realization that it really is all part of the same program authorized under a single law. So my learning objective for you all today is to understand what that network looks like, and where I sit in the network and my staff sit in the network, but also where you sit in the network, because this program was designed with the individual in mind. So we'll talk at the end a little bit about what y'all can do to support the work of preservation in Arizona and join the network. And I'm going to start us off right now. So let's see. How am I going to advance here? There we go. So who is the SHPO? Well, that's the first conundrum, is people will say SHPO, and what they mean is an office, or what they mean is a person. And the truth of the matter is it's both. So I am the State Historic Preservation Officer. I have been in this role for a little over 7 years. I am an appointee of the governor, which means that I serve at the pleasure of the governor, and I represent the state's interests in the federal preservation program. This State Historic Preservation Office is a division of Arizona State Parks and Trails, and we have a staff of, I say we're at 13 right now. We have some vacancies, and we're interviewing right now for another archaeologist position. But we're at about 13, and we handle all of preservation matters throughout the state with regards to our incentive programs. And with regards to compliance with Section 106, our jurisdiction extends to all state and federal lands outside the boundaries of Indian reservations that have tribal historic preservation officers. So when there is a tribal historic preservation officer present, I do not, or our office does not have jurisdiction there. We'll talk a little bit about that, not too much, but a little bit about that. So this entry slide is designed to be a snapshot of all of our programs at SHPO. I'm going to focus probably most heavily on the federalized programs. And those programs include working with federal agencies to comply with Section 106 of the NHPA, working with municipalities as part of our certified local government program, working with developers on the adaptive reuse of historic buildings and under the historic property commercial tax credit. And we do have a couple state programs that I'm not really going to focus on today, but I just wanted to make you aware of them. We have a very, very popular state tax reclassification program, where if you have a property on the National Register and you are living in it, you are entitled to receive approximately 50% reduction of your property tax. And then we have a brand spanking new program here, and you see it in the bottom left corner, our Dude Ranch Registry. It is not connected to the National Register, but it is a program that was as heritage businesses, that is Dude Ranch businesses, and lists them on a registry. And for those businesses, they receive a plaque and special designation and special marketing with the Department of Tourism. So that's more of a state effort. All right. So where do we begin? Why do we have SHPOs? So 1966, Lyndon Johnson is the president. And, this is a time that is considered to be a time of social justice concern, social upheaval, some would say. We've got Vietnam, pretty much we're in Vietnam at this point. We have Rachel Carson writing her very well-known book, Silent Spring. And we have recently started building our interstate highway system, which was, I think, commenced in the mid-1950s. We also have a program of aggressive urban renewal, in which we are doing what is euphemistically called slum clearing in the United States, giving people, quote, a better life through building them what would come to be known as projects, but this would be public housing. And what's happening with all of these programs is we are losing the historic fabric of our cities, and we are displacing families, disproportionately families of color, from their homes and from their neighborhoods. And we're doing that all under the name of progress and with federal dollars. So the National Conference of Mayors gets together and says, we have a problem here. And our problem is that if we don't hold the federal government accountable, we are going to lose some of our most vibrant historic assets. And I have a picture in here of, well, I can't really be interactive here, can I? Because we're in a webinar format, but I have a picture here of the original Penn Station. Can we?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll try to be as interactive as I can. But so here's the original Penn Station. It's the second photo on the left. And this was essentially a redevelopment using transit dollars. And again, if you look at it, it is classic Beaux-Arts architecture. It is gorgeous. So you're looking at losing not just the historic fabric of whole neighborhoods, because we're just not, we meaning the federal government, are just not providing that consideration. So the findings of the National Conference of Mayors is published in a volume called With Heritage So Rich. This is a reprint of it here, the third picture on the left by the National Trust, but that's the name of their report. And the findings of the report make it into the preamble of what would be known as the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm not going to read this all to you, but I really do. I'm not a fan of slides with tons of words, but some of the words in the preamble, they really resonate with me. And I find myself when I'm talking to my staff or when I'm talking to folks in the public using these phrases because they apply now the same way that they applied then. And the concept here is, why do we need historic buildings? And I'm going to say it's buildings that we're talking about now in 1966. Archaeology was not really front and center in terms of when this legislation was created. But we are talking buildings, but the same applies for archaeology. And it's this concept that we need a sense of orientation, that we cannot go forward in the future as a society if we don't understand our past. And we can't understand our past unless we preserve tangible elements, relics of the past, that a healthy society requires a mixture of resources that tell us where we've been. Jane Jacobs wrote a fantastic book in the late 60s called The Death and Life of American Cities. And it's the same concept too. She talks about needing a mixed vintage of buildings in neighborhoods in order to create vibrancy, to create incubator spaces for new businesses. And again, it's that idea of the sense of orientation. In the second paragraph here, I am emphasizing the findings of the National Conference of Mayors, that the current setup where essentially all preservation activities are privatized, that is essentially through the goodwill and efforts of small local historical societies, that is not adequate. And the federal government is not doing an adequate job of funding historic preservation. And then lastly here is sort of the crux of the legislation. It is nevertheless necessary and appropriate for the federal government to accelerate its historic preservation programs and activities, give encouragement to agencies and individuals that seek to preserve by private means, and assist state and local governments. And also the National Trust, which was created as part of this act, but the National Trust is a quasi-governmental nonprofit advocacy group for preservation. So that's the guts of it right there. It sets up what I like to say is a very elegant federalized program. I mean, and for those of us who have studied civics, the concept of federalism, where you have a governmental agency that has policies and funding that trickles down to states, and states implement the priorities of the federal government according to their own priorities. So, all right, so some things that the National Historic Preservation Act did. Again, it is our key policy document for federal preservation. It's established a partnership between the feds and the states in preservation, and eventually in 1992, when it was amended, it would establish a partnership between federal agencies and tribes in preservation. It established the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmark programs. These are the benchmark. The register is the benchmark that basically directs us to a baseline of what is considered significant, what needs to be considered in federal preservation programming. So the register is created. It mandates that each state has a state historic preservation officer that meets certain qualifications that are established by the Secretary of the Interior and that are also codified in statute. And critically, that state historic preservation officer is an appointee of the governor. It established an advisory council on historic preservation that oversees a particular part of the legislation, Section 106, which is the sort of meat and potatoes of agency review of undertakings and the effect on historic properties. It charges the federal agencies with responsible stewardship of properties, even when there is no undertaking. that would be under Section 110. And that is that an agency must maintain its properties, avoid demolition by neglect. And if a property is to transfer out of federal control, make the appropriate preservation provisions before it does transfer out of federal control. And then also, before a federal agency builds new properties or leases space and properties, they need to take account of the properties that are historic, that are within their control, and make sure that they have maximized use of those properties. The National Historic Preservation Act also established the concept of a certified local government. And a certified local government is a municipality that has been certified by the National Park Service to take on the role of preservation planning, very similar to the SHPO. So we'll talk a bit about that. So here's what it looks like. It does look a little bit like a pyramid, with the public, that is you guys sitting there at the bottom, providing the stability, the foundation of the entire program. So even though public is at the bottom, it is absolutely integral to the work that all of us agency folk do. So you've got the public at the bottom, the public represented by the certified local governments, mainly through historic preservation commissions, and the SHPOs providing guidance to the certified local governments and their commissions, and also a bit of funding. That funding is coming from the federal government. It is being passed through by the National Park Service. The fund that funds all of this preservation work is called the Historic Preservation Fund. It is not taxpayer generated. And that's a really critical point that I like to bring out, because some people will say, well, this is a frivolous use of taxpayer money. I don't like preservation. We have better things to do. Well, preservation is not taxpayer money. Preservation dollars come from royalties from offshore oil drilling. And they are basically funneled into an account, and it is a quite large account that accrues quite a bit of interest. Those funds are appropriated every 2 years. Oh, excuse me, they're appropriated annually. They are authorized every 2 years right now. So it's a very interesting funding structure. For those of you familiar with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, it is a very similar funding structure. So the federal agencies are essentially working with SHPOs to administer their preservation programs on their lands and within their actual programs if they're not land managing agencies. And above it all is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The long form name is the President's Advisory Council. So the President does make appointees to the council. The council right now, I believe, is about 20 individuals. And they represent state agencies, governors. There's always a governor that sits on the council. There's always someone who is a mayor or represents a municipality on the council. And of course, there's tribal representation on the council. There's representation from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Conference of SHPOs, which is my membership group, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. And am I missing someone? I'm probably missing someone, maybe National Park Service. But altogether, that is the preservation network. The National Park Service has an outsized role in terms of federal agencies because they are tasked. I mean, they do have undertakings in their national parks, but they do also have a technical services division that provides assistance to SHPOs, TIPOs, and applicants in several of their programs. They are also charged with granting HPF funds for competitive grants to qualified applicants, which largely are government agencies and nonprofits. And those competitive grants, some of you may be familiar with them. There's a civil rights grant. There's a Save America's Treasures grant for properties that are eligible at the national level. There's an underrepresented communities grant. And most recently, there's a grant called the Paul S. Broom Grant for essentially establishing micro-granting entities throughout the country. So I'm probably missing at least one grant, but there are competitive grants out there. They also administer our grant. So that is the SHPO, we are grant supported from the National. And so we report to them annually about our activities. And they check to make sure our activities are consistent with our comprehensive historic preservation plan. And essentially that is how we get our funds. In Arizona, we receive approximately $1.1 million of support from the federal government. And that's largely our operating budget. Several of us are on some grant money from Arizona State Parks and Trails, but for the most part, we are all operating on federal funds. Now, so what does Arizona State Parks have to do with the work of the SHPO? Why is the SHPO in state parks? And I usually tell them it's funding. I mean, to be quite honest, we had a state park system that was administering LWCF funds. And when the position of the SHPO was created, it's the same sort of funding source and funding process. So it does make sense to put us in an agency where we are able to draw down those dollars. Also, the National Park Service does have some very clear connections to state parks as well in terms of managing historic properties and providing technical services. So you'll find a lot of SHPOs in the United States are housed within state parks. California and New York are. But then there are other SHPOs that are their own entities, like the Texas Historic Commission. The SHPO is a division of that. And in Colorado, History Colorado, the SHPO is a division of History Colorado. And occasionally you do find SHPOs housed in economic development or commerce agencies and tourism agencies. So it really is just where in state government, the choice is made when the programs are established by the legislature, where to put the SHPOs. Okay, so what in particular is a SHPO empowered to do under the NHPA? Well, first of all, we maintain an inventory of historic properties. In many SHPOs, historic properties includes archaeological sites. Here in Arizona, we are fortunate enough to have had a preservation mindset way back, dating into the 1930s. And the State Museum here in Arizona takes care of the inventory for archaeological historic properties, or I should say archaeological resources, because the term historic properties is used once we've evaluated a resource and determined that it is eligible for listing in the National Register. At SHPO, we maintain the inventory for built environment resources. And again, what we are doing with that inventory is assessing whether or not any of those resources are register eligible. And if they are, they need to be evaluated in a federal Section 106 review. We administer the National Register program here in Arizona. We also administer an Arizona State Register. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the National Register program is housed at the National Park Service under the Keeper's Office. But the State Historic Preservation Act specifies, and again, this is another example of federalism, that the decisions about what gets on the National Register are influenced by the state. And so we have a state board of review. It is the Historic Sites Review Committee. They meet quarterly, or actually I should say they meet 3 times a year, so not quite quarterly. And their job is to look at nominations that are coming through either from municipalities, federal agencies, state agencies, or the public, to look at those nominations and decide whether or not they are indeed eligible for listing. I have a whole nother presentation on the National Register and all of the criteria, so I will decline to talk about that further. It is somewhat esoteric and somewhat of a process to get a property on the National Register. Critical, though, to understand is when we are dealing with making decisions about preservation, we really don't make the distinction about whether or not something is listed in the National Register or eligible for listing. Really, it is one and the same for decision making. For certain grants, listing is required, but just for the consideration under Section 106 in the State Historic Preservation Act, eligible is as good as listed. So that's why it's important that we have that inventory that basically has a evaluation of significance and eligibility attached to it. So we do review federal undertakings under Section 106. I'll talk a little bit more about that, although again, like the National Register, it's a whole process that we could spend at least an hour. Actually, we could probably spend an entire semester of university talking about that process. All of this comes together under the Comprehensive Statewide Preservation Plan. And this is the plan that the SHPOs are charged with putting together in conjunction with CLGs, federal agencies, and the public, of course, and nonprofit advocacy. And that plan is what essentially draws the funds down to the state. So we pledge to the federal government that these are our priorities in Arizona. When we are reviewing projects, we're going to prioritize the properties and the issues that are important to us as Arizonans. When we give money, we're going to also follow our plan. All of it cascades from the plan, and we are responsible for updating that plan and making sure it is filed with the National Park Service. Talked a bit about the Certified Local Government Program. We do administer that program. So when a municipality decides we want to have some of the roles of a historic preservation office, they go to us and they start the certification process, and talk a little bit about that later as well. We administer HPF grants. We pass through 10% of our aid onto those certified local governments. And again, there is a federal tax incentive program for developers of income producing properties. And we administer that on behalf of the National Park Service. They do the ultimate certification with the IRS, but we do all of the field reviews. And lastly, we assist and educate the public, kind of like what I'm doing here tonight. In 1992, the NHPA was amended, and a very critical change was made to recognize the sovereignty of Native American tribes. And the position of Tribal Historic Preservation Office was established in statute. In Arizona, we have, oh my gosh, I'm gonna do the count here. I think it's 14 Tribal Historic Preservation Offices. I've listed them all right here. The most recent ones we have would be the Hopi tribe. They've actually had a strong cultural resource program for decades, but recently became a Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And we're finding it here. Do we have Yaqui on here? Oh yeah, Pascua Yaqui and the Pascua Yaqui tribe. Those are the two most recent. Pueblo Zuni also reviews projects in New Mexico as well. Here we go. We have 21 Native American tribes in the state. So not all tribes are TIPOs. These are just the tribes that went through the certification process with the National Park Service. TIPOs receive funding from the National Park Service, the same as SHPOs. The formula is very different. And TIPOs, generally speaking, are woefully underfunded. They do receive an apportionment that's based somewhat on land area, somewhat, but not very heavily. And it's mostly just a simple flat division of funds between all TIPOs. So the reality is that the more TIPOs that are certified, the less funds available for any individual TIPO. And right now, I think the average TIPO receives something like $87,000 of funding, which is not very much at all. So we do our best at the SHPO to leverage the good work of the TIPOs to the best that we can while respecting sovereignty. But this to me is a huge issue that we need to solve on a national level. So a lot of folks on this webinar who have knowledge of federal agencies and what they're doing with regards to historic preservation probably are drawing that knowledge from the Section 106 of the NHPA and federal agency compliance. So this, some people say this is the meat and potatoes of the NHPA. It's certainly part of the reason why the National Conference of Mayors decided to convene and draw up this plan for a federal preservation program. So Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertaking on properties that are listed in, and again here, or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. By use of the word undertaking, and actually I think I have a slide. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I'll talk about that in the next slide. An undertaking can be quite obvious, like a road construction, or it can be something very subtle, like permitting an event, or permitting a change in flight path. Or the guts of Section 106, essentially, if you strip it down to its bare bones, is that the federal agency needs to produce a very clear, structured decision-making framework on whether or not their undertaking is going to have no effect on a property, no adverse effect on a property, or an adverse effect, and allow the SHPO of the state that the undertaking is in, or the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the opportunity to comment on those efforts. So even though this is called the National Historic Preservation Act, preservation is not the necessary outcome of what is being accomplished here in Section 106. Section 106 is a structured decision-making process that has an element of transparency to it. And the process is outlined under a code of federal regulations. So that's like implementing regulations for the law. And critically, the process involves public consultation, public input. I think that sometimes federal agencies forget that. And sometimes we see it accomplishing in a pretty pro forma way, where they roll it into a umbrella environmental review, like National Environmental Policy Act. But when I'm talking with the public, I always want them to know that they have a role in NHPA consultation. And if there's a particular agency or a particular area, like say a particular forest that you are interested in, you should be able to go onto their website and have an understanding of where they are in their review of critical projects that they're required to consult under. You should be able to do that. And again, one thing I also want to underscore here is that consultation with TIPOs and tribes is absolutely a requirement. That's the 92 regs, basically hammer that home. When a federal agency is operating on tribal land, they are just dealing with the TIPO. When they're operating outside of tribal land, they are dealing with the SHPO. And then the TIPO is engaging as a tribal consulting party. So tribes have already, gosh, I want to say dating back to the 1990s, tribes here in Arizona have worked with the State Museum, and to a lesser extent, the SHPO, but with the National Park Service, mostly through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, to identify areas of the state where ancestral affiliation is of concern. So generally speaking, when a federal agency is engaging with a tribe, they know where they are on the map and which tribes have a concern for that area on the map. So again, what is an undertaking? Just some examples here. Some of these are familiar to Al, because we've got grazing permits on there and grazing improvements. And this photo is taken from the NRCS website. So this would be actually a federal undertaking in which a federal agency, so this would be the Natural Resource Conservation Service, is granting funds to producers, what's called agricultural producers, in this case ranchers, to make improvement on a patchwork of private, state, and federal lands for the benefit of the health of the grassland and ultimately the economic stability of ranching. So that's a release of funds that would trigger a Section 106 review. I've got a picture here of a controlled burn. That is actually, as we are entering an era of I would say climate change, it's just that's sort of an understatement. We're entering a new era in which aridity and heat come together, and our forests just are routinely burning. We see more and more of these controlled burns, and we actually have a huge program right now, or a programmatic agreement with the Forest Service about how these burns are conducted and how to avoid effects to historic properties during these burns. I've got a picture of open pit mining, quite obviously a very destructive undertaking for historic properties, as well as road and bridge construction here. In the top right corner, you see what I see? It's a stealth tower. This is a cell phone tower. FAA licensing and permitting is a federal undertaking, and the developers of those Verizon cell phone towers have to, and they don't like it very much, they have to actually talk with Caroline Klabaha, who's on the phone. she's online right now. This is her agency. And occasionally when we are dealing with visual effects to historic properties, mitigation will be applied. And so you may see something that looks an awful lot like a sketchy palm tree, which is usually a visual mitigation for an adverse effect. Lastly, in the bottom right corner, I have a photo there of a monitor, and what that is supposed to convey is a landmark decision in the Ninth Circuit. Basically, City of Phoenix sued the FAA for changing its flight path, basically taking flights out of the Salt River, the dry Salt River and riverbed, and moving them through the historic districts of Central Phoenix, causing really inconvenience of large sound, vibration that could potentially damage historic buildings, and not consulting with the public or consulting with the city as a certified local government when deciding to do so. So essentially, the city did win this suit, and the FAA had to go back and do an entire new evaluation and eventually reverse the flight path. So that can be an undertaking as well. Not a single shovel went in the ground, but a major administrative change that affected historic properties. Okay. I have a whole presentation where we talk about Section 106, but I'm going to limit it here to like one slide. So here we go. And then please, if you have questions, which I'm sure you do, I think I see there's some already showing up in the chat. No, not yet. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So Section 106, again, like I said, structured decision-making, it is a process. So it is a process. The federal agency is the lead. They own the process. And at the outset, what they need to be able to do is say, what are we doing here? We've got to identify what our undertaking is and what is the area of potential effects of that undertaking. So in other words, when we're doing this undertaking, what is the physical footprint of, or excuse me, the footprint of physical disturbance that could harm or have an effect on a historic property? And what is the footprint of something that is perhaps not a direct effect, but an indirect effect to that property, like, for instance, constructing a road in a relatively remote area may lead to access into that area, which would be an indirect effect on a historic property. So your area of potential effects should include that consideration, and should essentially, create a almost like a catchment area for what new access would look like, and what historic properties are in that area that could be affected. Visual effects are also of concern, particularly when we are dealing with, say, something like a cell tower, and a cell tower, particularly maybe in a non-urbanized area where we have resources that are landscape level resources. And we see this a lot with tribal concerns about traditional cultural properties, where you've got view sheds for sacred mountains, or along a sacred river like the Colorado River. Cell phone towers can present quite an issue. So you're identifying historic properties by establishing this area of potential effects, and then doing a formal inventory what's inside that boundaries of that area of potential effects. Typically speaking, when we're dealing with public lands, that inventory looks a whole lot like archaeological survey, pedestrian survey. We've got a picture. This must be an old picture, because I swear I see people with, I think like long lines of tape. And I think I remember like when I used to do survey, we had like meter tape and compasses. So yeah, I think it looks a little more modern nowadays with, I can't even think, Trimbles, things like that.
GPS.
GPSs, thank you, Al. So that's typically what you see on open space areas, public lands. But I mean, if you have an APE that's in an urban area, you're going to be deploying architectural historians to go out and inventory historic properties that could be affected. So it would look a little bit different. And then lastly, the federal agency, once they have that inventory, they need to look at those properties, excuse me, I should say cultural resources, and determine whether or not they are register eligible. If they are register eligible, they move forward in the process in terms of evaluation of effect. If they're not register eligible, generally speaking, they kind of fall out of this sieve and they don't move forward in that process. When we talk about effect assessment, what we're really talking about is the effect to a property going to be adverse? So that is applying the criteria of adverse effect. And the criteria of adverse effect is, will that federal undertaking affect a feature of that property that makes it eligible for listing? So let's think about archaeology. One of the sort of the most character defining features of a register eligible archaeological site are intact stratified deposits, context. And if a project is going to disturb the ground and disturb the deposits and thereby disrupt the archaeological context, that would be an adverse effect, because that is affecting a character defining feature of this particular property that makes it eligible, this particular class of property that makes it eligible for listing in the register. And that would vary from resource to resource. So when we're dealing with cultural landscapes, there's other aspects of character defining qualities that we're concerned with. When we're dealing with buildings, that's an entirely other concern as well. If there is an adverse effect, and yes, we do see that quite a bit, the regs specify that the federal agency must resolve that adverse effect. It doesn't mean they have to avoid it. Again, this is why it's, even though it's called the National Historic Preservation Act, preservation is not always an outcome, but resolution always is. And so when you have an adverse effect, the federal agency notifies the SHPO and the advisory council. We have an adverse effect, and we're going to work with you to codify an agreement of how we're going to resolve it. And resolving it looks a whole lot, when you're dealing with archaeology, traditionally, it looks a whole lot like data recovery. And when I first became an archaeologist, I had no idea that the projects that I was working on when they were data recovery projects, and to a certain degree, the projects I was working on when we were out in the field doing survey, I had no idea that they were being accomplished in service to the NHPA and in service ultimately to a federal agency. I was a 20-something kid working for a company that was, let's say, ADOT, or working for ADOT, and ADOT was receiving federal highway dollars from the Federal Highway Administration. That's how far removed I was from understanding what I was doing. But the reality is, it is in service to this whole process, and that's where you wind up. Nowadays, we are starting to look at more, I don't want to use the word sophisticated, because, you know, archaeology is sophisticated, but I would say we're looking at alternative types of mitigation that does not necessarily involve digging up an archaeological site and curating the objects in a federally approved curatorial facility. What we're finding is a lot of tribes really don't want their artifacts in a museum, and really are tolerant of mixed contexts and disruption to sites, and that they understand that it's part of sort of the cycle of development. And so what we're starting to look at is forms of mitigation banking. Funding programs that are language and cultural programs for tribes, looking at other alternatives, perhaps looking at acquiring land for preservation of other sites or committing to preservation of other sites. With regards to historic buildings, resolution of adverse effect often looks a lot like photo documentation and perhaps some other additional research and historical documentation. That documentation is prepared and put on file with the Library of Congress as part of the Historic American Building Survey or the Historic American Engineering Record. So that's typically what we see for resolution. In 1982, the state of Arizona basically said, oh, wait, what about us? We have this SHPO. This person, we don't really understand what she does, mostly does stuff with the feds. Can she do stuff for us too? Or I don't know if it was a she, it was a he back then, I guess. So in 1982, the legislature passed the State Historic Preservation Act, which essentially is almost like a companion act to the NHPA. It's annoyingly different in little like niggling ways where you just have to kind of catch yourself and be like, nope, we don't do that with the state, we do that with the federal. But for the most part, it's designed to do the same thing, which is to basically create accountability among state agencies for the work that they do and how that work affects historic properties. So it established a benchmark for how we designate historic properties, and that's the Arizona Register of Historic Places, which, as we operate it here in Arizona, is pretty much the same thing. It established sort of rules of conduct for state agencies, that they would serve as stewards for properties, that they would have a staff member that is charged with essentially administering their preservation program, that they would reuse properties that are under their control that are historic, that they would avoid anything that would damage a historic building. Archaeology, again, is not explicitly referenced in the State Historic Preservation Act, but archaeological sites are historic properties, so they are in there. And again, there's a similar process of review under the State Historic Preservation Act. It is very loosey-goosey. I have to say, it is not as well articulated as Section 106. And basically what it has state agencies doing is consulting with us at SHPO or with the SHPO on agency projects or what they say, agency plans that could affect historic properties. And oddly enough, if there is an adverse effect or adverse impact, because that's the language of the State Historic Preservation Act, if there is an impact, it doesn't really provide much guidance on how to resolve that impact. So unlike the NHPA, there is nothing that compels a state agency to really do anything other than disclose to the SHPO that there is an impact and allow us to sort of help them brainstorm alternatives. The way it works on the ground, most agencies are pretty good about this, and it's very rare that we see just the unilateral decision to destroy a historic property. For the most part, agencies will work with us to avoid an impact, and if that is not avoidable, to do some sort of mitigation. Okay. When we are working under the National Historic Preservation Act, we are working with federal agencies that have a special government-to-government relationship with tribes. That relationship is established, arguably, some say in the Constitution, but most definitely under executive orders. And there are several executive orders that mandate effective tribal consultation. Provisions for government-to-government consultation are pretty much in almost all of the federal environmental legislation. So that includes National Historic Preservation Act, but also National Environmental Policy Act, the Federal Lands, gosh, Kim's on here, Management Act. ARFA is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And NAGPRA, of course, is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The federal government is, there's a whole body of law that examines the federal government's responsibilities to tribes as holding land, even if it is land that is straight out public land, but holding it in trust for tribes for tribal use. And so that is a big part of federal consultation. Some federal agencies delegate their consultation to tribes. In my mind, they shouldn't be, but I would say the one that I'm thinking of right now is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where they will have the proponents of pipelines or transmission lines out there working with tribes. But for the most part, government to government consultation as defined by tribes is truly only government to government. And even the SHPO, us here at the state level, we try to stay out of that and respect that and only engage when we are asked to by tribes. The state does have a tribal consultation statute. It's relatively recent. And that statute is overseen by the Governor's Office of Tribal Relations. And each state agency has its own consultation policies for when it engages with tribes. And again, SHPO is not involved in that one bit, actually, not at all, which is sort of awkward at times. But so, yeah. Okay. I would be remiss if I didn't show you this nifty tool, which is open source. I mean, anyone in the public can access this, and that is our government to government toolkit. This was a project that was a collaboration between Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and the Arizona SHPO. It was funded with grant funds from a mitigation bank of a project that went very, very much sideways by the Federal Rail Administration. And the mitigation for that was they created a huge fund that all all tribes could apply for to essentially fund projects related to preservation. So this project, or excuse me, this toolkit is designed to allow federal agencies, state agencies, municipalities, and even proponents, private proponents, like solar developers, mining companies, to be able to go on a map, identify where their project area is, identify the tribes that claim ancestral affiliation in that area, and then do a deep dive into documents that are prepared by the tribes explaining how they want to be consulted for various classes of projects and who to contact at those tribal offices. So it is a very handy tool. I have people telling me that all the time. It's just a Google site. It is not fancy, like everything with SHPO, it's super low tech and, held together with rubber bands and chewing gum, but it does the job, it does the trick, and we are one of the only states that has something like this. And just, it's amazing sometimes that something so simple can solve so many issues. But so I've got the link there, and I know Al is recording this, so you can either scribble it down or just, it literally, if you go into a Google browser and put Arizona government to government toolkit, this will pop up. All right. I mentioned a bit about those certified local governments. So we're working our way down the pyramid in case you haven't noticed. And we have a lot of them here in Arizona. Oh my gosh, I think it's 31 or maybe 30. I don't know. But I've listed them all here so you can find your community and see if you are a local government. We have one county in the mix, and that would be Pima County. Pima County is a super user of the preservation program. Just straight off the bat, the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan is really a model for how to do preservation planning. Pima County has bonded to acquire historic properties and rehabilitate them for adaptive reuse for residents of the county. And they apply for grants routinely to continue inventorying open space and identifying where those sites of significance are for planning purposes and also nominating. So they do a pretty good job of actually designating properties on the National Register. So what does a certified local government do? Well, they have an ordinance. So when you hear someone complaining that I can't do this to my house, SHPO says I can't do it, they won't let me replace these windows, or I need to, that's not SHPO. That's the certified local government. That means that historic preservation is in their code, which is compulsory. You know, you have to follow code and ordinance. And so we don't have a code, say, so we don't really regulate development at the local level. If it's federalized and has federal funds, you know, we're in the mix. But when it comes to you as a property owner and what you're doing with your property, we really don't do anything with that. So that would be the local government itself and the historic preservation officer and preservation planning department. They have the ability to designate properties on their own local register and to landmark them and put preservation overlays on them. The overlay is what triggers a process of design review. Design review can occur by staff. Sometimes it occurs by historic preservation commissions. Pima County and Tucson have a joint commission. It's very complicated. I feel like things get reviewed like 3 or 4 times. But essentially, that is exactly what is happening. Staff is reviewing, and technical members of the committee are also reviewing. I have an example graphic here of what design guidelines look like. They're very general sets of guidelines that CLGs produce to let folks know, here's what we would consider to be an acceptable modification to a historic property. And here's what we would consider to be a non-acceptable. So in the case I provided below, I think this one is from Phoenix's design guidelines. And what they're showing here is how to essentially put an addition on a historic building. And in this case, they're basically creating a brand new building and connecting it to historic through the use of what they're calling a transitional element. And I'm sure you've seen that treatment quite a bit. It works well. And there's a series of principles, which is a whole nother presentation about how to do that. The Secretary of the Interior has established a set of 10 guiding principles for how to modify a historic building and still maintain its integrity and its continued listing in the National Register. And lastly, so we're at the bottom of the pyramid now, and we're talking about public education and advocacy. The public is the foundation of everything we do. Absolutely. Some opportunities for the public to get involved in historic preservation. I mean, you're doing it right now through your membership with Old Pueblo and all of the various activities, tours, educational programs that are provided. I threw some other examples from Southern Arizona in here. The Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation, they focus mainly on built environment resources, although I have seen them engage in Section 106 reviews for archaeological resources. They just wrapped up Tucson Modernism Week, which is a very popular lecture, building, multimedia event that they have annually there. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is a pretty well-known entity at the national level. They have a very glitzy magazine that's super cute, and they run a bunch of campaigns. Their latest campaign actually is going to have a lot of influence here in Arizona. They have recently received a large donation or bequest for supporting preservation projects along Route 66, especially those that tell the story of communities of color or communities that are underrepresented in our preservation framework. So we are looking right now at getting some grant funds for a property that is in Peach Springs on the Wallapai Reservation. And that would be the Osterman gas station. The National Trust for Historic Preservation actually listed it this year as one of its 11 most endangered properties in the United States. So they have identified it as a property of key significance to the Route 66 story, and also a property that is worthy of institutional support. So that's really important. I've got, of course, Archaeology Southwest on here as well. They do, of course, their own programming, their beautiful magazine, and they really do quite a bit of work in joining consultation for Section 106. And in fact, most recently, they partnered with, oh my gosh, Tohono O'odham and San Carlos Apache to really petition the Bureau of Land Management to put the skids on a project right now known as the SunZia Transmission Line Project, crossing BLM lands. BLM is the lead federal agency. And the three parties basically stated that they did not feel that tribal consultation was adequate, and that landscape level cultural resources were not properly identified and accounted for in the treatment plan for that project. In this case, the advisory council agreed, and there has been a stop work order for all elements of the project in Arizona and New Mexico. So that's pretty significant. So that kind of shows you what good advocacy can do, and that is public advocacy. Lastly, I have a sign here for our little symbol of our Arizona Site Steward Program. The Site Steward Program, I see several site stewards on here tonight. Thank you for your service. This is a fabulous program. These folks, I want to say, I hope they're not the unsung heroes. I think of them as just heroes. We have right now close to 600 active volunteers that work throughout the state, assisting land managing agencies, federal, state, and municipal, with monitoring the health of their archaeological sites under their jurisdiction. And when I say health, I mean really the integrity, making sure that there is no willful destruction or even natural destruction in terms of erosion occurring to sites, documenting it when it is observed, and making sure that the land managing agency is aware of it. Site stewards also engage in a ton of special projects, including rock art recording, stabilization work. The Site Steward Program is phenomenal. It has been around since the 1980s. I've heard various folks say it was the first in the country, and then somebody told me no, it wasn't the first, but it was the best run and most notable and had the largest participation. So we are still nationally known for that program. After many years of it sort of getting backburnered by state parks and trails under their own administration, we have it back in SHPO, and we're currently working to codify all of the training, right size the program, make sure that we have good resources for the volunteers, and just very proud of the program. And then lastly, I've got Preserve AZ here. That is our statewide historic preservation conference. It is produced jointly by staff at the State Historic Preservation Office and the Arizona Preservation Foundation. I didn't put them on the slide. They are our premier statewide preservation organization. And every year the conference moves to a different certified local government. So that is the third partnering organization. This past year we were in Tucson at the Tucson Convention Center, actually just a couple of weeks ago. This coming year, 2024, we will be in Prescott at the Hacienda Inn. And that will be June, I believe, 25th through 27th. We're actually doing 2 conferences in one calendar year, and I probably will lose my mind, but trying to get back onto a summer schedule where more people can come. Okay, so where I want to end up right now is, so how does this network run? How do we make sure it runs smooth? And we do that all through effective preservation planning. Our comprehensive historic preservation plan, each state has one on file with the National Park Service. It actually has to be approved by the Park Service. The plan cycle is 5 years. So every 5 years, there should ideally be a new plan or a plan update. We have not, we meaning state of Arizona, we have not engaged in comprehensive planning since 1996. I don't even think I had email in 1996. Pretty sure I didn't, or maybe I had AOL. I definitely had a dial-up modem, I can tell you that. So we are woefully in need of updating our plan, and really from the ground up, like grassroots. No more updates, no more looking at our priorities and saying, oh, they still are priorities. How do we tweak them? How do we develop a work plan based on these priorities? We are going to establish all new priorities, and those priorities are going to be driven by our social, economic, and environment and natural environment. And sort of what's going on in our milieu that is affecting how we preserve our significant resources. We're going to identify classes of historic properties that are particularly significant in Arizona, or perhaps even unique to Arizona. And again, goals and priorities that for all levels of the network can be addressed so that we can all work in concert. So that if I am giving a CLG a grant, or a municipality a grant, or a nonprofit, I have a measure of comfort that they are working to advance either one or more of the goals in the state historic preservation plan. If we are teaching historic preservation or archaeology to students in classroom environments, we are referencing the plan, and we are making sure we meet the objectives of the plan. And again, we do this all in service of the very real fact that we have very few dollars for preservation. And that if we are working at opposite ends, or working in a non-coordinated fashion, we're just basically wasting human capital as well as dollars. So we need to be all working together in order to move the needle forward. So that's where we are right now. I have received, the SHPO has received a grant and aid from the Bureau of Land Management to support planning efforts. We have hired, I can't even believe this, I shook the couch cushions, and we were able to hire a legitimate planning consultant, Partners in Brainstorming. They are working with us on developing the plan, which includes robust stakeholder engagement and also robust polling. So where we are right now is we are on this arrow of plan development. We are in the stakeholder phase. And by stakeholder, stakeholders are generally like users of the program, and they can be kind of lumped together in classes, like CLGs are a stakeholder. Let's see, the professional archaeological community are stakeholders, avocational archaeologists are stakeholders, site stewards are stakeholders. So this is like in the collective. Tribes are not stakeholders, so we have them separately. Tribes are sovereign nations, and their input has a different level of gravitas than, say, a collective stakeholder. The public, I mean, in a real sense, public is always a stakeholder. But really where the public kind of fits in is when we have the stakeholders identifying, kind of getting the universe of what the concerns are to the general public, some of which, and I don't even count you guys as general public, because you all have some degree of interest in historic preservation archaeology, or you would not know that this webinar is happening tonight. But the public, the general public, grandma sitting in an armchair somewhere watching CNN, or the science teacher over in Ajo. These are people who might not know what the federal preservation program is, or even that we have archaeological sites in Arizona. We're going to do robust polling of those folks just to gauge the temperature on, how do you feel about preserving these types of properties? Is this a good use of funds? If we did it this way, if we had more programming, would you come to programming? So we'll be doing a lot of public polling. And actually, I'm doing something a little different. I've never seen another SHPO do, but I'm also polling children, which is kind of a hard thing to do because you have to get parental permission. But I really want to gauge what is going on with our youth. and how we can best serve them through our programs. Right now in Arizona, we have somewhat of a crisis in our profession of preservationists, and I would say arguably also the archaeological profession. We don't have the next generation coming up in the ranks. They're not choosing these careers at the same level that folks of my generation chose this type of career. And these are good careers. They're, as SHPO staff will tell you, very fulfilling, very fulfilling. And we really stand to lose if we're not able to create a talented pipeline that will get us from high school to college and into the workforce. Right now, we have no established Department of Historic Preservation, or no one program where you can get a 4-year degree in historic preservation in the state of Arizona. Doesn't exist. There's a certificate at the U of A, but that's the best we can do right now. We have also an applied anthropology program that is struggling a bit at the U of A and at NAU, and a pretty robust anthropology program at Pima Community College. But again, that is a 2-year program. So we really need to collectively think about what we want for the future, and creating a trained workforce is got to be part of it. And we've got to start with the kids. All right. I think that's as good a place to leave it. And I talked way longer than I thought I was going to talk. Oh my goodness, look at that. So let's I don't know how you want to do this, Monica. You want to go through the questions and just sort of lob them at me? And
you bet. That was great information. Thank you, Kathryn. I'm going to go into the Q&A. I'm going to start with Umberto. He says that in Flagstaff, the National Forest has been very involved in land swaps, land sales, etc., because the town is growing. The ideal of the National Forest Service is to preserve forest, but urban grown changes things as far as preservation. Does SHPO make these kinds of deals with developers?
no, especially, I mean, we're a 13-person office of archaeologists, historians, and architects. Our policy impact is pretty limited. So we don't develop anything. And we certainly aren't land managers or authorized to participate in any sort of land deals. Yes, federal agencies can remove lands from federal control, but again, it does trigger Section 106. And they have to inventory those lands and know if there are historic properties on them. And generally speaking, we treat that as an adverse effect. So that land transfer needs to have a plan associated with it for how adverse effects are going to be mitigated, whether it's archaeological sites or whether it's built environment resources. So yeah, it does happen. But generally speaking, it's political. The most famous land exchange right now in Arizona, or I should say notorious, would be the land exchange that occurred for Resolution Copper. Resolution Copper exchanged a parcel of land that has significant resources on it to the Forest Service, and the Forest Service has committed to preserving it. But in exchange, they did receive a significant parcel of land that happened to have a significant ore body and also a traditional cultural property of the Apache people. And it's problematic. And that was an act of Congress. So that really was not something that had any public input.
David has a couple of questions. One, are there penalties for violating Section 106?
Are there penalties? No, there are no. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. So a federal agency, when they violate Section 106, we actually use the term foreclosure. So the violation occurs when they have not properly consulted and they go through an undertaking, maybe destroy a property. And in which case the advisory council will get involved. They will comment on the activity, and they will essentially, I hate to use this, like they will tell on them to the So each agency has a bureau or a department. So say the agency is the BLM, Department of the Interior. Say the agency is the Forest Service, USDA, or Department of Agriculture. So the advisory council will send a letter, and then it is up to the federal agency to decide how they want to move forward with that project. Now, that said, when Section 106 is violated, and this is again the role of the public, lawsuits happen. So yes, so essentially, SHPOs can sue. It hasn't happened here in Arizona, but a SHPO can sue a federal agency for violating Section 106. More often than not, we get organizations like the National Trust, Center for Biological Diversity, and gosh, what are some other enjoyed Archaeology Southwest? Those are the folks that wind up suing in court. And in which case, if the case is won, either the project is vacated, it cannot take place, or there's some sort of mitigation or restitution that is paid. But it's not, I mean, it's not a criminal penalty per se. It's because it is a federal agency.
David also asks, Kathryn, as our state historic preservation officer, what keeps you up at night?
Oh my God, this is such a good question.
Yeah, and what are your biggest challenges?
Staff is laughing at me right now, the staff that are on the phone, because yeah, I am an insomniac right now. I don't think it has anything to do with my job, but I think I went to bed at 3:30. Something's going on. I think it's getting old. But so what keeps me up at night? I mean, like euphemistically, what are some of the things that really weigh heavily on me right now? We have an unprecedented amount of funding coming into this state through the CARES Act, IJA, Infrastructure and Jobs Act. We have a new piece of legislation, the Replant Act, which is a Forest Service piece of legislation that involves essentially creating healthy forests, which involves replanting and ground disturbance. We have no less than, we also have broadband, a very aggressive broadband program being deployed right now. We have no less than $8 billion of work coming into this state, like now. And I have a staff, when it comes to Section 106, I have a staff of four, maybe 3.5, 4 people to handle $8 billion of projects. So that weighs really heavily on me, because it is not a good look for our office to be bottlenecked. It is not a good look for us to be holding up projects, holding up progress. Generally speaking, the look that we want to have is one of efficiency, where we are assisting our federal agencies in getting to decisions quickly, expeditiously, and while also making sure that we uphold our commitments to tribes and the public, because these are our resources in Arizona. And so yeah, that weighs really heavily. We don't have enough funding, we don't have enough capacity. And I wish it was as easy to say, okay, I just need more money. But the truth of the matter is our pipeline of jobs is super dry. So even if I was to get $1 million appropriation from the state and they said, go ahead and hire 3 additional people, I wouldn't get enough applicants to probably make that work. That's how bad the pipeline situation is right now. So that's a little worrisome. Other things that worry me, the situation with our tribes is dire. So I say that I've got 4 people doing reviews, but a lot of our tribes, they have 1 person doing the $8 billion worth of work reviews. And it's exhausting for them. And so that puts a huge toll on me. I've seen some, and just in the past month or so, some really significant properties that if we don't get tribes help, they will be lost. And there will be permanent damage to culture and religion as a result. So that weighs heavily on me. It weighs heavily on me anytime we are working in the Section 106 process where we're dealing with a heritage resource that's of significance to a folks' religion tribe's religion or culture, because it is a structured decision-making process, and the outcome is not guaranteed, and oftentimes the outcome is not preservation. And just on a personal level, that can be very difficult.
Speaking of tribes, Al asks, when did the state of Arizona start formally consulting Indian tribes about state undertakings, and when did it establish its Office of Tribal Relations? And can you give some examples of how some state agencies do tribal consultations?
Sure. So Janet Napolitano established an executive order for tribal consultation. And I want to say, gosh, when did we have Napolitano? Well, she left with the Obama administration. So I'm going to say in like, maybe it was like 2006, 2007. I don't know. So that was the executive order. Didn't have the force of law. Governor Ducey basically ran a bill and put it into law. And that year would have been 2017. And I think that is when the tribal or the Office of Tribal Affairs was created at that time. So that was before it must have been 2015, because it was before I got here. All that statute does is it tells state agencies to put a plan for consultation together, which ideally stipulates what types of programs will receive consultation. So keep in mind, it's not just for undertakings, it's for everything. It's for, if you are the Department of Health, you are basically describing how you're going to consult with tribes for flu shots, how you're going to administer flu shots on tribal land, things like that. So, I mean, it really didn't contemplate historic preservation or impacts to archaeology or anything like that. So a lot of state agencies, their plans don't even have anything about undertakings and effects to historic properties. And I have no role in that at all. There's nothing, SHPO's not in that. So I can't say, oh, you need that in that plan. Can't do it. Now, there are other agencies like state land, game and fish, state parks, and the universities, and they do actually have provisions in there about their facilities and consulting with tribes. And I've seen that manifest in various ways. So for the universities, for those of y'all who are in the know, the 4 southern tribes, so that would be Tohono O'odham, Akchin, Gila River, and Salt River, they kind of they consult collectively, and they meet once a month in a working group meeting. And I see the universities consulting regularly through that forum. Arizona State Parks and Trails, which is my parent agency, they have a tribal liaison. Actually, the statute says every agency has to have a tribal liaison. So our agency has a tribal liaison, and she consults on programs like family camp out, everything like that, or trails plan, things like that. And also if they have any major capital improvements at a park, those will be added in as well. But yeah, it's not like the feds. It's not as clear cut, and it's totally discretionary.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have right now. And on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology, I'd like to thank you, Kathryn, for sharing all this information with us this evening. And I also would like to thank the audience for joining us tonight. And please consider making a donation to help pay for Old Pueblo's Zoom subscriptions and program expenses, and to support Old Pueblo's educational programs. And thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Monica and Al, and thank you, everybody. It went by fast.
Thanks again.
Take care.
We will be posting this on our YouTube channel, by the way.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.